All right, chapter 14, starting with page 372. So over here, there's a globe, and the process of global distillation is discussed. So our pollutants, because of ocean and wind currents, end up in the poles, and mainly the North Pole. And so even though up here, the animals and humans that live up here don't really use those chemicals, they are disproportionately more heavily affected by those chemicals. Down here, we have indicator species that tell us if there's pollution because they're more sensitive to it. And so make sure that you study and read this paragraph in here. Page 373, we have something called a POP, a persistent organic pollutant. So your book doesn't talk about it, so I have a little star, and we abbreviate it POP. And it's a chemical that resists degradation, so it doesn't break down. So degradation is breaking down, so these chemicals do not break down. Low water solubility, so that means it doesn't dissolve in water. That's a problem. And then it has long-range transport via water in the ocean and wind currents, which is your global distillation on the previous page. POPs also are carbon-based, so even though this is a different color of ink, there's more information that the AP test lately wants you to know about them, so I added this information. Most POPs are carbon-based, and the two main examples are DDT and PCB. They are banned in most countries, including the United States, but are still around because they do not break down. So even though DDT was banned 50 years ago, it's still around. It doesn't break down, and it ends up mostly, well, it's in our environments too. And it's like there's a big pile of DDT at the bottom of the ocean off the coast of Southern California, a little bit south of us, by Palos Verdes Peninsula, because there used to be a DDT factory and they were allowed to dump their waste into the ocean. Like they were allowed to, it was legal. They weren't breaking the law back then. And then we banned DDT, but that stuff's still out there at the bottom of the ocean. It's getting better now. It's actually getting buried by sediments. It's not really breaking down, but it's getting buried by sediments. Okay, turning the page to 374. So on this page, know what bioaccumulation is and biomagnification. So this is when toxins are accumulated mainly in the fat cells of our body, and then they can get in higher and higher concentrations as you go up the food chain. And so DDT is a classic example of something that does this. It gets accumulated in small amounts, like 0.4 parts per million in the zooplankton, and then it accumulates into a higher amount in a small fish, and now it's accumulating into 2 parts per million in the larger fish, and now it's accumulating into 25 in the osprey, which is a seabird. So the accumulation in the fat tissues is called bioaccumulation, and then as you go higher and higher and higher and higher concentration, that's called biomagnification. So what does DDT do? Well, it makes the shells weak in bald eagles, osprey, bound pelican, and the peregrine falcon. So these are all birds that have had problems. Since the ban of DDT, the bald eagles have made a comeback actually, and now there's one that flies over Santa Clarita on occasion, and we haven't had one in decades here. Some toxins break down into other toxic compounds. So DDT takes a long time to break down, and when it does, it breaks down into DDE. You don't need to know the chemical formula, just DDT to DDE. But both are toxic, so even though it broke down, it doesn't mean that it is fine. It's not fine. Our top predators have high levels of developmental deformities because of bioaccumulation and biomagnification. So for example, tuna and swordfish in the ocean have high levels of mercury. So what happens is mercury gets into our oceans in the process of burning coal, and you'll learn about this later on. But coal has mercury in it. And when you burn that coal, the mercury goes airborne. And then the rain hits it, and it goes into streams and rivers and flows into the ocean. And in the ocean, it's going to be in small amounts in the water, but then it's absorbed into the plankton, and it bioaccumulates into their fat cells, and then into the smaller fish and bigger fish. And then these are top predatory fish. They're powerful top predatory fish. So if you eat a lot of tuna, you shouldn't have a ton of tuna per week. There are limits. So how much? Well, if you Google tuna calculator, you can punch in your weight and your sex and what kind of tuna you eat, and it will tell you how much you should have a week, because your body can process some amounts of mercury, but not a ton. So if you have tuna every day, a tuna sandwich, or you go to sushi a lot, you should plug in that tuna calculator and see how much you should have for your weight and sex. Humans can have reproductive and circulatory system problems from biomagnification. So these things affect us as well. So the toxins in there, including DDT and mercury and lead and other problems from persistent organic pollutants, POPs, can create problems in us. Another thing that you need to understand about biomagnification is that it occurs when the rate of absorption is greater than the rate of elimination in the body. So what this means is, okay, you don't have to ban tuna. You love tuna. Have your tuna sushi. Just don't have it every day. So what you have to make sure is that your body can eliminate it through the kidneys and through the liver. Those are two organs that eliminate toxins. So you have your lovely sushi, it's yummy, your sashimi, your rolls, your tuna rolls, your spicy tuna rolls, and you eat some of tuna that has mercury. Pretty much all tuna has mercury. And if you regulate how much you eat per week or whatever, then your body can get rid of it through eliminating through your livers and kidneys. So bioaccumulation is only when you eat more than your body can eliminate in a certain amount of time. Okay, down here are a couple of scientists that are covered by sticky notes. We have Louis Gillette, who studied the alligators, and we have Tyrone Hayes, who studied frogs, and they're both really important in studying gender deformalities with endocrine disruptors. They are famous scientists in this field, and read about their studies in that caption. Turn to page 377. So on this page, know the definition of ED50, dose response curve, threshold, LED50. Okay, so we're going to do a lab to help explain this to you. So, and a worksheet. So if you don't quite understand it now, that's okay. You'll understand it more later. But basically, this is a linear dose response curve. So if there is some sort of toxin, and not an endocrine disruptor, mainly the other ones. So let's say this is nicotine. So in nicotine, a low dose, not a lot of deaths. So this is 50% of people die, 100% of people die with a certain amount of dose. As you get higher and higher doses, more and more people are going to die until eventually there's some dose that will kill 100% of people who smoke that much nicotine or eat that much caffeine, or those things don't usually kill you. It's more like things like heroin or fentanyl or bleach or ibuprofen if people overdose on those things that we're talking about. And we'll go over this more with our worksheet. Okay, so down here we have another one that has a threshold. So what this means is that the body has some sort of a tolerance. And so there's no deaths up to a certain level, and then deaths begin with dose at the threshold. And then down here is more an unconventional. So this would be more of endocrine disruptors. So you have more deaths, and then it kind of goes down because the immune system kicks in. If a substance has a high LD50, it means it's low toxicity. It means it takes a lot to kill you, and so that's not very toxic. Low LD50 means it only takes a little bit to kill you, so it is very toxic. On page 379, okay, so in the lab we can do LD50 studies with toxins on rats, and we do that, but we can't do that on humans because we can't, like, expose humans to toxins. But we can see what happens when humans were already exposed to toxins. The most famous study is in the Yaqui Valley in Mexico, where some children were exposed to certain farm chemicals and others weren't. And so they can compare the developmental stages of the children that were or who weren't. And so they were already exposed, and then they go and see what happens after that. And that's called epidemiological study. Turn all the way to page 383. And so this section talks about, well, how do we protect from toxins and things like that? Well, the only one you have to know from this chapter is something called the Delaney Clause of the Food and Drug Cosmetic Act. And basically, additives that cause cancer cannot be put into food. The other things in this chapter, the other laws and protections, are not required to know for the AP test, but it's good to know as a citizen what things are put into place. Like down here, the Toxic Substances Control Act and the FDA and EPA guidelines, etc. All right, page 384 talks about the Dirty Dozen. So these are the 12 most dangerous substances that were banned in a treaty called the Stockholm Convention, and the U.S. signed it. So all of these substances cannot be used in the United States, but they are still used illegally or legally in some other countries. So some other countries still use them, and then some places still use them illegally, like on our food, and especially things like marijuana is grown with a ton of illegal pesticides. Even though it's not supposed to, in California we have legal marijuana now, but you can get a better crop if you grow it with these banned pesticides, and so then people end up smoking these banned pesticides, thinking that they're getting good clean marijuana, but they're not. So that's a big kind of problem in that industry. And then also sometimes it's used illegally on our food, especially coming from other countries. All right, that's it for chapter 14.